Greetings, I'm your host, Dr. Wolfula, and when I'm not accusing women of witchcraft just for knowing how to read, I'm here at the Wolfula reviewing movies. Well, it's been a while since I've made a proper review, but the reason I've been gone so long is because I was watching the recently released Fear Street Trilogy on Netflix. It takes a while to binge through all of them. I think the release of these Fear Street movies snuck up on a lot of folks. Their release was announced out of the blue, but in truth, I was anticipating them for a while. The Fear Street Trilogy is based on R.L. Stine's young adult horror anthology book series of the same name, begun in 1989, which comprises over 150 books. Holy shit, how much stuff can happen on one street? This recent trilogy of films isn't the first attempt to adapt the Fear Street franchise. Of course it wouldn't be. When you have a book series that's been around for over 30 years and has sold 80 million copies, of course Hollywood is gonna want a taste. Initially Disney, because they need to own everything, purchased the rights to Fear Street during Goosebumps Mania in the late 90s, planning to release a film through their Hollywood Pictures label, but a movie never materialized. Disney did attempt to make a Fear Street TV series in 1998 on ABC, and while the pilot wasn't picked up, it did have the greatest TV intro I have ever seen, which is simply a CGI skeleton grooving out for 30 straight seconds. It's fucking incredible. The trilogy we got in 2021, though, began its life in 2015 at 20th Century Fox, and after 4 years of development, the films were shot back-to-back over 6 months in 2019, from March to September. The trilogy didn't come out until mid-2021, though, nearly 2 years after production ended. Why was the Fear Street trilogy shelved so long? Well, these movies were supposed to be theatrically released. Each movie released a month apart in 2020, but guess what happened in 2020? Most movie theaters weren't open, and 20th Century Fox was bought by Disney in 2019 because they need to own everything. And Disney probably wasn't interested in taking the massive gamble of theatrically releasing 3 R-rated horror movies over a 3-month period in 2020. So the Fear Street trilogy was sold to Netflix, where the movies were released weekly, which honestly is a far more logical strategy for releasing these films. I don't know why they originally thought a monthly theatrical release would be a good idea. It just sounds like a plan to lose a lot of money. Netflix dropped the first Fear Street movie without a lot of build-up ahead of time, like with a lot of their stuff, and it's honestly the best way to handle these kind of things. It doesn't come with high expectations going in, and it encourages word of mouth, but with all the post-release hype and 3 films out now, you're probably wondering, is it worth not only watching the first Fear Street movie, but binge-watching this whole trilogy? Each of these films is nearly 2 hours long. Nearly 6 hours is a huge time commitment in this workaday world we live in. I mean, 6 hours is a quarter of the length of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, should you watch the Fear Street trilogy? Well, maybe at least a third of it. Let me elaborate further in my review. The Fear Street trilogy is obviously divided into 3 films, but in actuality, the story across the 3 films is broken up into 4 distinct parts. But Fear Street Quadrilogy doesn't have the same ring to it. The Fear Street films are named after the year they respectively take place in: 1994, 1978, and 1666. Now, the films have a running storyline that ties them all together, so it might seem weird that each film goes further back in time, but it's kind of sort of a Stephen King's It situation going back and forth in time. The core story is told in Part 1, 1994, but there are 2 flashback stories told in between, with Part 2 and the first half of Part 3. The plot shifts back completely to 1994 in the second half of Part 3 to conclude the story. It's a little difficult to review all 3 films in one vid without spoiling shit. The trilogy is technically 3 separate movies, but like with a lot of trilogies, they make up one larger story. For the sake of not spoiling each film though, I will simply be reviewing them individually, focusing on the core story told in each part, but at the end of this video, I will discuss all the spoilers with a warning. Let's begin though with, naturally, Part 1, 1994. Part 1 begins with a cold opening at a mall. Now, for you younger viewers, a mall is basically like Amazon.com, but it was a building you had to physically travel to shop at, which is sadly why so many malls are out of business.
Thank you for shopping at B. Dalton's. Have a nice night.
Essentially, an employee at B. Dalton is closing up her shop. Hey, when was the last time you heard about B. Dalton? Anyway, as she closes for the night, she finds herself relentlessly pursued by a dude dressed as the Grim Reaper, who has already killed any mall rats that still lingered. This intro is highly reminiscent of Scream's famous opening with Drew Barrymore, just at a mall, and let's be honest, Uma Thurman and Ethan Hawke's daughter here is no Drew Barrymore.
Your mother was no Sharon Stone.
Skull Mask here acts and looks very similar to Ghostface, and several moments in the opening look like they were duplicated from Scream. I went into this movie completely blind. I didn't see a trailer, and I hadn't even looked at a poster for the film, so I was afraid at this point that the movie was just going to be a competently made Scream clone. But after Skull Mask kills the store clerk and is revealed to be a friend of hers, the killer is swiftly dispatched. Wow, the police are already there? He wasn't even black! With the killer seemingly dead from the start, Fear Street Part 1 breaks away from its ties to the Scream franchise. Well, the music that plays in the intro does sound like a ripoff of music from the original Scream, but that's because the composer is the same guy who did the music on the Scream movies. He's just ripping himself off.
More death in Shadyside.
Basically, each Fear Street movie pays homage to classic horror films in service of its meta-narrative, but there's more going on in them beyond the surface-level cosplay. The Fear Street trilogy principally takes place in the fictional town of Shadyside. The settings, some names, and a few Easter eggs seem to be the only solid connection the films have to the book series. The background mythology from the books is heavily reimagined, and there isn't even, to my recollection, a reference to the actual Fear Street, the location where most of the books take place, which is why the series is called Fear Street to begin with. The films instead tell new stories that just sort of pay tribute to the books, but aren't adaptations of any of the books themselves. In some ways, this is good, because it means you don't have to be familiar with the books to appreciate the movies. And if you're a fan of the books, you get totally new stories. But at the same time, it ends up making these movies seem like they only have a superficial connection to the books they're named after, just to have a bankable title with a nostalgic author's name attached. It's why we got two Goosebumps movies that were basically just Jumanji movies with mostly generic monsters in them. I'll admit, though, that it's a compliment to say that if these movies didn't have the Fear Street title and R.L. Stine's name attached, they'd work just as well on their own. From the get-go, the Fear Street trilogy is far more an homage to the horror film genre than R.L. Stine's writing. Shadyside is a slasher villain's paradise with a 300-plus history as the murder capital of the USA. The town was supposedly cursed by a witch named Sarah Fear in the 1600s, and every generation since, seemingly normal townspeople snap and become slasher archetypes that go on killing sprees. This new version of Fear Street's mythology is very reminiscent of the Blair Witch mythology, where every few years deaths happen in Burkittsville. It's like an extrapolation of the concept of Rustin Parr, the child murderer that is forced to kill by the Blair Witch. Fear Street Part 1, taking place in 1994, might even be a nod to the year Blair Witch Project took place. In contrast to Shadyside's bloody history is its sister town, Sunnyvale. Where everything goes wrong for Shadyside, everything goes right for the prosperous town of Sunnyvale, stirring a long, bitter rivalry between the two neighboring towns. The feud between the two towns is one of the core aspects of the film trilogy, but something I feel is a missed opportunity is that Sunnyvale isn't explored much, and the Sunnyvale residents shown in the film are all irredeemably terrible. It would have been interesting to have a Sunnyvale teen involved in the story who was born there, starts out rotten, but has an arc where they somewhat redeem their town. Instead, Sunnyvale feels very one-dimensional.
Pieces of shit! They think they can do whatever they want!
The films are primarily about Shadyside and its residents, though, and the first film principally focuses on a teenage girl named Dina, played by Kiana Madeira. Dina's going through a rough patch because Sam, the girl she was in Lesbians with, has moved to Sunnyvale and has since been ghosting Dina, letting somebody else get a handful of her.
You broke up with me, remember? So stop acting like I'm the bad guy.
When Sam accompanies her boyfriend to troll the bus full of Shadyside students heading home, Dina decides to get her ex-girlfriend wet in a different way, to disastrous results. Dina comes to Sam's aid, though, along with the help of... There's something about this green fuck that seriously pisses me off. Just looking at the guy makes me really angry. On an unrelated note, subscribe to my zombie servant Goulash's new channel, The Gulag, where he has 3 videos available to watch now.
She's fine.
Oh my god.
Anyway, after the car crash, Sam witnesses a series of satanic visions. I see that shit every time I get into a fender bender. It's irritating. After the crash, things get back to normal. Well, a guy dressed as the recently slain Skull Mask killer is on the loose and is stalking Dina and her friends, but hey, at least the insurance companies weren't involved.
Oh, hey, Peter. See, you got the full costume now.
Initially, Fear Street Part 1 does seem like it could just be an unofficial reboot of the Scream series, angling for some 90s nostalgia while beating the next real Scream sequel to the market. You got the black-cloaked, mysterious killer targeting a diverse group of savvy teens, with the only thing missing being the meta shit, but there's more at play than what meets the eye. Like I mentioned earlier, a witch has cursed the town of Shadyside, so there's a deep-rooted supernatural element to Fear Street Part 1, and the characters find themselves being hunted by multiple murderers from Shadyside's past, who are each unrelenting in their pursuit and appear to be virtually indestructible as they kill anyone in their path. The Fear Street films totally earned their R rating. Part 1 has some pretty gory kills, some of which are inventive and brutal. It makes it feel like the characters could die at any moment. There's a strong sense of vulnerability, and with the villains so overpowered, it puts that sense of vulnerability over the top. It also helps that the characters I felt were written, performed likably enough, and each one serves a key role in the story beyond just being fodder for the killers. Dina's computer nerd brother Josh is knowledgeable of the town's mythos, and is crucial to figuring out the weaknesses of the killers, while also being a good comic relief.
Step out of your internet fantasy nerdland and get in the car.
Step out of your depresso and I'm gonna die alone land.
Somehow, the movie manages to make the two drug dealers, Kate and Simon, likable to me, and I kinda honestly like them more than the couple, Dina and Sam.
Lights and darks, and watch for stray socks.
Remind me what's in it for me again?
Dina and Sam's relationship is the core of the trilogy, but I didn't feel like there was a whole lot more to them as characters beyond said relationship. They're both very gloomy and deadpan. They could honestly both be the same person. I suppose it could have helped if we got a flashback to them when they were originally together and on better terms, just to give us a better idea of them as people and let us know the true stakes and power of their relationship. But as it stands to me, Dina is just an adequate, steadfast heroine who gets the job done, but I feel neither one way or another about her. Then again though, I kinda feel the same way about Sidney Prescott, and she has a lot of fans that are begging for her to not be killed in Scream 5, so there might be something I just don't see in Dina that others will. Speaking to experiences of marginalized groups that I have definitely personally never experienced myself, and I can't say with any authority if they ultimately pulled it off in this film, but I will say it is admirable that they made the attempt at all. At the same time though, everything should specifically appeal to me. They made superhero movies about women. I'm not a woman or a superhero, how dare they? Jokes aside, I do appreciate the fact that neither Dina and Sam are lesbian stereotypes. They are simply young women of their time who are gay. While their relationship is at the forefront, they aren't defined by their sexuality, which is unfortunately not always the case with gay characters in media.
And like tonight's been the first time I felt like myself in months.
Look at that spoiling things. I did enjoy Fear Street Part 1 overall. It's solid as a slasher film while also providing enough new twists to the formula to make it feel like a fresh concept. The cast is good, the film looks great, there are some good practical gore effects, and even the CGI is pretty good and used appropriately. I have some gripes with Fear Street Part 1 though. For instance, the movie overuses licensed music and doesn't use it in the right spots, paced out well. For example, there's a scene transition where Cypress Hill's Insane in the Brain plays. Classic song, one of my favorites, but it doesn't really fit the scene. And then 10 seconds later, Radiohead's Creep plays. A totally different kind of song that actually does fit the scene, but is jarring to hear so soon after Insane in the Brain. This is a problem that extends to the whole trilogy. It's like every 5 minutes there's another piece of popular music that plays. Like they're really trying to flex Netflix's music licensing muscle. It feels like most of the time the music that plays is just there to either give people a nostalgic I like that song reaction, or just make boring scenes more interesting. There's a moment in Part 2, for instance, where Bowie's Moon Age Daydream plays over a scene where a character opens a can of paint. Such a fucking waste. Could have put that song anywhere else, especially since Bowie is so important to Part 2's story. Licensed music should only be used in a film or TV show where it can tie in thematically to the story, elevating the meaning of a few key moments, not just thrown in haphazardly on a regular basis so you can share your fucking Spotify playlist. Hearing a beloved song play becomes less special when it's actually important if a film is wallpapered with beloved songs throughout. My other problem with Part 1 is the third act. It feels like things get aimless and the characters suddenly decide to make some illogically stupid decisions. The kills at the end don't feel properly earned, where the characters that die actually get to put up a proper fight. They just have to die very quickly in rapid succession to, last minute, pad out the body count. The movie falls apart a bit at the end, and I felt really disconnected from what was happening. Even though the plan to defeat the killers was an interesting idea that the film sets up early. I like the first two acts of the film, but they just lost me at the end, unfortunately. But here's the thing. There are two other parts, of course, and Part 1 has an epilogue that acts as a sequel hook for Part 2. I won't spoil how all three parts are connected story-wise right now, because that would spoil Part 1's story. But again, each part in the trilogy, at their core, contains a story that works as a standalone narrative, just with 1994's story wrapping around Part 2 and 3's flashback stories. So let's get into Fear Street Part 2, 1978. The sequel takes place entirely at Camp Nightwing, and no, it's not where Batman's former ward Dick Grayson goes to relax. It's a summer camp in 1978, and it's always golden hour during the day at Camp Nightwing because that's how you know it's supposed to be the 70s. The camp is located between Shadyside and Sunnyvale. In fact, it's the site of Union, a settlement 300 years ago that was the predecessor of Shadyside and Sunnyvale, before the two towns went their separate ways. Much like Bennifer, but it looks like those two are back together now. Camp Nightwing is also a location from the 12th Fear Street book Lights Out, but this film has nothing to do with that book besides sharing the same setting. The main character of Part 2 is Ziggy, played by Sadie Sink, a rebellious teen girl who is constantly bullied and harassed by campers native to Sunnyvale.
Well, that's it, Berman. 5 strikes. You're out.
I'm out? They just tried to murder me!
Ziggy's older sister Cindy is a camp counselor herself, who's a little goody two-shoes that Ziggy doesn't get along with.
Oh, so now you care.
Ziggy, this is serious.
Yeah, well, it was serious earlier and you didn't give a shit.
Other counselors include a couple sleazy, lazy counselors who have non-stop fuckathons.
Have to finish cleaning the outhouse.
We did shit jobs all summer, now we have to clean up actual shit. No?
Nick Good, the future sheriff of Sunnyvale, seen in Part 1, who has an interest in Ziggy.
We kick her out, somebody's gonna ask about the burn on her arm. Then who's in trouble, huh?
And also there's that Eldon Henson-looking dude from Halloween 2018.
What if the killer's still out there?
That's the whole point, Gary.
After the camp's nurse freaks out on Cindy's boyfriend Thomas, predicting that the boy will supposedly die later that night regardless, the deranged woman is taken away, but the counselors discover a book belonging to the nurse that leads them to the long-abandoned home of Shadyside's witch Sarah Fear. The counselors unwittingly end up unleashing a killer from within Fear's domain, who stalks Nightwing's campers during their annual color war match, and yeah, kids get killed, which is something Jason Voorhees never had the guts to do. Obviously, Part 2 is a pastiche on 80s summer camp slashers like the Friday the 13th series and Sleepaway Camp, though I think the only reason why this movie takes place in 1978, the year Halloween came out, is because they wanted to avoid making another thing that takes place in the 80s, because 80s nostalgia has been done to death in the past 10 years. I'm gonna state up front, though, that Part 2 might be my least favorite of the trilogy. It may take place in the 70s, but for all intents and purposes, it's going for an 80s slasher vibe, and 80s slasher throwbacks have been done to death, especially trying to emulate the Friday the 13th series. It's very by the numbers in its approach and doesn't bring much new to the table that wasn't done already in Fear Street Part 1. I will say that I enjoyed the main characters of Part 2 more than Part 1's main duo. They have a much better arc over the course of the story, but even though the characters are largely better, it's what you do with them that counts, and a great deal of the movie is spent with two of the counselors trapped in a cave together while the murders are happening, and it's really fucking dull. It felt like padding, so all three of these parts would equally be 110 minutes each, but they really needed to trim a lot out of Part 2. There's so much unnecessary, redundant shit. I think that's an issue with films and shows that are streaming now, especially on Netflix. They don't have the same restraints that come with time slots or have to take into account an audience's time, because streaming movies aren't in a theater, so you can just pause them, which means a lot of the time, creators of streaming content will just include everything they can, even if it's not necessary to the plot or tanks the pacing.
The witch is real. And she's doing some fucking spell shit and possessing people.
Also, even though Fear Street Part 2 is superior to Friday the 13th movies on a technical filmmaking level, it doesn't quite understand that the main appeal of those films is a cool killer and the kills. Most of the victims in the movie are kids and their deaths aren't shown. The few deaths shown are nothing to write home about, except for Oscar's death. I love watching that kid get killed and stuff. So part 2 kinda sucks. Is Fear Street Part 3 1666 any better? Well, yes and no. Part 3 is actually split up into 2 separate parts. One half is another flashback story, while the other returns to 1994 story to wrap up the whole trilogy. Chatting about that second half comes with massive spoilers, so I'm gonna focus on the first half story for now. Part 3 goes back to the settlers' times in the year 1666, which is a little on the nose, I think, but that's pretty much the only really pulpy thing in this part. Part 3's first half is taken extremely seriously with a much more somber tone. Dina is essentially shown a vision of 1666, inhabiting the body of the witch Sarah Fear, while witnessing the early days of Shadyside and Sunnyvale, back when they were one town called Union. Other cast members from the previous 2 parts also play characters in this story, but I think it's an artistic choice and to help Dina relate more to Sarah Fear's story by putting in some familiar faces, because otherwise I'm pretty sure there weren't any black or Asian Puritan settlers. I will say that they probably should have just recasted for the Puritan flashback of this part, because honestly the cast accents leave a lot to be desired.
The wit is 1,000 years old. She drinks the blood of virgins to keep her youth.
Well, you're safe then.
The initial tale of Fear Street Part 3 is essentially Sarah Fear's origin story, explaining the hows and whys of what led to the curse on the town of Shadyside and the original murders that happened in Union, perpetrated by a mad pastor named Cyrus Miller, who kills all the kids in Union, harvesting their eyes. Savage as fuck!
I can see now. I can see everything.
Part 3 feels very much like a Blair Witch origin film. A lot of the details are very similar. The film overall has a very tense and eerie feel to it. It's the darkest and most serious of the 3 stories, but it just doesn't have enough fun stuff like the first 2 stories, and feels like a major shift in tone, telling a very basic witch hunt tale that we've seen told a million times by now.
No. Witches! Witches! Witches!
The major sticking point of the story is that, well, Sarah is caught sticking her tongue into her friend Constance's pussy, which, you know, is a little nasty considering the hygiene of this era. This was before toilet paper was invented, for God's sake. Of course, this was a time where you could just point at a woman and she'd be hung for witchcraft, so the whole town accuses the 2 lesbians of witchcraft and they have to survive while trying to uncover the true evil happening in Union. Again, the story is creepy and genuinely uncomfortable, but we've seen stories like this told countless times, and it's played too straight without enough of the razzle-dazzle seen in the first 2 parts to keep things entertaining, so it was kind of a slog of an hour to sit through watching it.
Maybe the devil is in me.
Stop it, you sound like Mad Thomas.
Perhaps Thomas is right.
You'd think Part 3 would be my least favorite of the trilogy then, but it redeems itself with its second half, returning to 1994's time and capping off the whole trilogy story. Now, here's where I finally talk major spoilers. Skip to this time code in the video right now if you want to avoid spoilers and hear my final thoughts. In Part 1, Sam was targeted by the Shadyside killers, and the only way they would go away is if Sam was dead. So basically, the plan was for her to OD and then Pulp Fiction her back to life, which worked, except Sam becomes possessed herself.
We have to get her back.
Dina manages to pacify her GF and takes the girl to the only known person with experience with this kind of thing, an adult version of Ziggy from Part 2, played by Jillian Jacobs, who helps them find Sarah Fear's MacGuffin hand, but the vision that Dina receives of Sarah's life reveals that Sarah wasn't a witch at all, but took the blame, and that the local sheriff's ancestor is actually behind Shadyside's curse. Through a pact with Satan, the good family would write a Shadyside resident's name on a wall, and that person would become a possessed, immortal murderer, sacrificing their fellow Shadyside residents, and these deaths power the wealth and prosperity of Sunnyvale. It's sort of like a San Francisco and Oakland situation.
All of Sunnyvale gets better and better.
Shadyside doesn't.
The only way to sorta permanently end the bloodshed is by, well, killing a guy. Sheriff Good, to be precise, who is the mastermind behind the recent murders.
Wanna help us kill Sheriff Good?
Let me get my coat.
The plan the heroes have is to lure all the killers with Dina's blood to the mall, where Union and Camp Nightwing once stood, and have the killers commit suicide by murdering Sheriff Good. It turns out more difficult than it seems, though. At one point, the heroes have to drench the killers in the blood and have them fight each other, which is some fun Freddy vs. Jason shit. In In the end, though, Dina confronts Sheriff Good down in the caves beneath the mall, and Sarah Fear successfully vanquishes the sheriff, destroying the killers for good and lifting the curse from Shadyside. And that means bad shit can finally happen in Sunnyvale. Everybody gets a happy ending. Well, except Sunnyvale, but who gives a fuck? The end credits do have a possible sequel hook, though, but more likely I wouldn't be surprised if this trilogy spawns an anthology series on Netflix actually adapting each of the books. Overall, I did enjoy my time with the Fear Street trilogy. My only major issues are in the editing with the pacing of this 6-hour story. I didn't really like the flashback stories all that much. They really slowed things down having 2 prequel stories that are 3 hours together sandwiched between the main story, which I enjoyed a lot more. I suggest giving Fear Street Part 1 a watch at least. If you enjoyed it, continue with the trilogy, but if it didn't do anything for you, you won't like the next 2 parts either, so just skip the rest in that case. I give the Fear Street trilogy a killer skeleton out of dancing skeleton. Look at him go! Hell yeah! Well, like I said earlier, my zombie servant Goulash has his own new channel, The Gulag, and his latest vid reviews the first Addams Family movie, and he'll be reviewing the rest of the Addams Family film series next. Subscribe to Goulash today. Link below to watch his new video. This video is made possible through the pledges of my Patreon supporters, and I'd like to give a very special thanks to the kind folks pledged to my shoutouts tier. All of the support on Patreon means a lot to me, and it helps my dark influence continue to grow. If you like this video, like it, and if you loved it, click the subscribe and bell buttons for more vids. Be sure to also keep in touch by following me on social media at Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Dr. Wolfula. While I still have your attention, consider pledging to my Patreon to support the channel and get bonus content like previews, VIP Discord server access, private movie night streams, and credits in videos. Consider pledging at patreon.com/Dr. Wolfula. Also, check out official Dr. Wolfula t-shirts and other merch on tpublic.com/user/Dr. Wolfula. Thanks for watching. See you all next time. Dr. Wolfula signing out.